Nigeria. I particularly remember when I left the leadership of a DFID program to go into government, and we tried to, I know how hard you tried to ensure that the program was owned by the people of Nigeria, and that the beneficiaries spoke with one voice about what they wanted from the program, which is completely in line with best practice, but it's not something that very many donors do. So I have very fond memories of all of the efforts we made in Nigeria on elections, on public governance reforms, on conflict and all of that. And I'm sure that you'll continue the good work in Tanzania. So thanks for everything you did in Nigeria while you were here. Okay, so today's discussion is actually an opportunity to ask you a number of questions, which bizarrely I didn't have the opportunity to ask you when you were in Nigeria. So I'm looking forward to asking you a number of questions. The format is that we will speak for about 40 to 45 minutes, and then we'll be able to take a few questions from the audience of listeners. But it's great that Buzz on Earth provided us the opportunity to this discussion on issues of governance and democracy, development generally, peace and conflict. All of those things that matter to our existence on this planet as human beings. Buzz on Earth is the leading media hub dedicated to mainstreaming sustainability, wellness, and coexistence. And they are a one-stop shop for sustainability stories, innovations, thought leadership, and eco-friendly brands. They have an audience in more than 190 countries and nearly 8,000 cities, and that is growing every day. And they're defining sustainability as the new growth imperative. Buzz on Earth is rated among the top 10 sustainability YouTube channels globally, and #1 in India for 2020. And Buzz on Earth also ranks in the top 30 sustainability blogs in a global listing by Feedspot rating. So although it's a cozy conversation between friends, the whole world is watching. So let me put you on notice in that regard. So thanks again to Buzz on Earth for this opportunity, and thanks again, Oliver, for obliging us. So I'm going to start with my questions now, and that is to say that for most of your working, you've worked on governance issues in some of the most challenging, sometimes dangerous environments in Africa. And I'm sure that, like the rest of our audience, you won't be surprised that I wonder why you do it. Why do you, are you a glutton for punishment? Why do you go to the and what is it that drives you in the work that you do?
Joe, thanks. Yeah, it reminds me when my wife and we first moved to Kinshasa. My wife's family thought it was a punishment, but actually it was it was my choice. I wanted to go to Kinshasa and work in Congo, and it was a really fascinating place. Let me start by saying, I guess I should say to start this, I am a civil servant, and what I'm going to say today is not necessarily the British government's position. You're getting me as Oliver, so I'm not sort of talking on behalf of government. I'm also as you know, Joe, I'm not an academic in that sense. I like traveling around doing things. So I'm going to try and keep things simple for people. And I'm not one to use academic language anyway. So I'm going to try and keep my sort of language accessible to people and not use complicated jargon if I can. If I do, please let people ask questions and I will try and explain. But I think, yeah, you've got a little bit of a hint there of what I enjoy about it. I think there are two aspects to it. I started my career in the Treasury in London, and then spent a little bit of time also in the Cabinet Office working on sort of modernising government. I learned a lot from that. It was fascinating. But you're very far removed from what's really going on and what the action is. And at that level, you don't really understand what is happening. I think that's one of the things that really motivates me is understand why things are as they are. And a lot of the answers to that are around governance. I think that motivates me, traveling around and trying to understand why things are as they are. And the other part of it, particularly in the sort of development business, is I think we're really very privileged to be able to actually help other people. And helping other people rather than helping yourself, I think, is a very rewarding, satisfying thing to do. And I find it so. So bringing those two things together and had the opportunity then to live in a number of different countries, all wonderful places, the same in Congo, in Ethiopia, in Nigeria, now in Tanzania, also in France and Belgium, in Europe. I really enjoy this work. As you say, sometimes it can be dangerous or difficult, but it is endlessly fascinating and rewarding.
I can totally relate to that. I worked in the Cabinet Office myself, and I think at a point you feel that you're a small cog in a very big wheel, and that while you're dealing with the finer points of various policy papers, it's not affecting the price of bread directly, and you're not affecting of people. So I can very much understand that attraction to get out and get involved in changing the way that people are governed. But one of the most important aspects of the way that people are governed is the way that their leaders are elected and elected. And you've done quite a lot of work supporting free and fair elections across Africa. And in his book, The Bottom Billion, the academic Paul Collier of Oxford University says that in the countries where the 1 billion poorest people in the world live, which incidentally will include many of the places we've worked, like Nigeria, Democratic Republic of the Congo, South Sudan, and also India, where God on earth is based. That in such places, democracy has actually increased political violence rather than reduced. And many people say to me, if you look at the East Asian countries, like Malaysia, Singapore, the drive for development was pushed by people they term benevolent dictators. I often say to them that I'm not aware of any African dictator that has been benevolent, so I'm not sure it works for us.
Yeah.
But people ask the question, should we continue to pursue democracy? And knowing what you know of Africa and the various places in which elections work and governance work, should we persist with democracy?
Yeah, this question, Joe, reminds me when I first started sort of working on governance in Africa, and I started looking at issues of elections. Yeah, what I found was that elections were not a time of sort of anticipation or excitement for people, at least not in a positive way. they tended to be a time of fear. People said, oh, no, it was a bad thing that the elections were coming around again because there were risks to security in so many places. And I think that obviously that is sad. And it is one of the questions that I've been trying to sort of answer in my time working on these questions. I think partly the causes of violence are not linked necessarily to elections. There are causes of violence and divisions in society more broadly that elections perhaps sort of exacerbate. And then, of course, I think the question too is that elections in the wrong way can be divisive. If you think of cases where you have countries where you have two big ethnic groups, one is a majority and one is a minority. If you have elections that always give that majority power every time, that's not really that's not going to be conducive to an ongoing peaceful governance environment when you've got one big group of people always excluded. So I think part of the answer is that elections in themselves are not democracy. Democracy is a lot more than elections, and democracy is also a process, which I would say also is never finished, because it's all about a political system of sort of regulating power. And when you've got power, there are always people who want to misuse it. This is why I'm with you around benevolent dictators. You may get some. I think there are some men and women in Africa and elsewhere who, for a number of years, have done a lot of good for their country, who weren't necessarily democratically elected. But I think the whole debate around term limits, again, would suggest that if people are in power for too long, however good their intentions to start with, sooner or later, most people tend to go down a negative path in terms of governance. So I think a lot of it is about how you construct your political system and your democracy in the country you're in. If you have big differences between sort of ethnic groups, you need to find a way through that electoral political system that does share out that power. I think a number of countries in Africa are going down that road. I think Kenya has made a number of reforms looking at how you can push down power. And Nigeria, when I was there, people were always talking about these questions around the model, the power of the presidency. And is it right that so much money should go to the presidency, to the federal government, as opposed to the states? So I think the question is all around how you regulate power, but you need to have the constitution and your electoral system that fits with the status of the country, that divides up that power in a fair way, so you don't have any ongoing issues where large groups of people are excluded. Because if you do elections in democracy in the wrong way, then I think you have too many. You can have a lot of people excluded from access to resources, excluded to power, and that can, of course, be a driver of conflict. So I think you have to look at what democracy means in the bigger sense, constantly work towards it, and look to use your system to share out power in a sort of more inclusive way that also enables those in power to be held to account. So no democracy, in my view, is ever finished. It's always work in progress.
Yeah. You were telling me before we came on that the painting behind you is from the election process. What was that like?
Yeah, I think I have very fond memories of that time in Kinshasa. I was there from 2004 to 2008. And one of my abiding memories was the enthusiasm of the Congolese people to go out and vote, firstly on the constitutional referendum, where they hadn't been able to sort of vote at all, and then following that in the sort of first free and fair elections that had happened for 30 odd years. It was amazing to see the enthusiasm of the people for that vote and to be able to choose their leaders. And I think that is still there. And I think that's what you find in every country. I don't know Singapore, but but there must be some sense of legitimacy, I think, in any country. And in the past, that's come from maybe sort of for religious sources, but in the modern era, the idea of legitimacy comes from the people, expressed through elections. And I think you pretty much anywhere you will find in the world, people want the freedom that comes with it, because with elections goes the rule of law. If you lose, you stand down. If you win, you still have to respect certain rules when you're in power. You have to, you have to collect taxes fairly. You have to spend those revenues for the benefit of everybody. Obviously, not putting it in your own pockets. You need the judges and the courts to enforce those rules. Without any of those things, without that rule of law, then democracy is not happening. I think that's what I took from Congo, was that real enthusiasm. And you see that not only in Congo, but in other places too, when you haven't had elections for some time. And that painting there, I said it was painted. My colleagues in the embassy collected together some money and they got this picture painted for me. It was really, really nice, and it highlights the sort of vibrancy and the color and the life of Congo in those elections. So it's a really, really nice painting.
It is a beautiful painting from here. A lot of laughter, a lot of joy. So yeah, beautiful. Okay, so you're currently the governance team leader for the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. Actually, in Tanzania. But I would describe you first and foremost as a proper governance professional. And we find it interesting that there aren't actually as many proper governance professionals as you would first think there are. And we know this when we're looking for governance people to design governance programs, as an example. And, it's often a struggle to find people with that breadth of experience of public finance management, public service reform, policy and strategy development, peace and democratic governance, external accountability, all of these things you've gained experience over time. But apart from being a governance person, you've also held positions that have given you the opportunity to support social development and conflict reduction. And I wonder how you have managed this in your head, this nexus between governance, security, development, democracy. What is the interface between them, and how do you reconcile this in your own mind?
Yeah, I think partly that is, as you say, sort of an artificial external construct, in the sense that we have security experts and conflict experts and governance experts and humanitarian experts, and they all come to, what is a complex problem from their own perspective. And let me maybe take the example of from Nigeria, of the problems in northeast Nigeria, and go back a few years when I was there looking at some of those sort of challenges as to how how the international community can help in that context. If you ask the security people, they will say, we need to defeat Boko Haram. We need to help defeat Boko Haram. If you ask the humanitarian people, they will say, we need to provide food to those IDPs who are starving. If you ask the social development person will say, well, we need to listen to people's voices. We need to be more inclusive. If you ask the conflict person will say, well, there are some very deep-rooted historical grievances that we need to tackle. But if you go, for example, say to somebody in position of authority in Borno State, say the governor will say, look, we've got people who need to go home. For IDPs, we need to make it safe for them to go home, and we need to provide them what you need. And at that perspective, you then have to bring everything together, because you have to look at how do you provide security for those people to go home? How do you provide them emergency food when they need it, but then transition to building systems for education and health and water so they can live sustainably? And then, of course, you need to listen to them to understand how to do it and address the causes of conflict. So when you're in that, if you're out in external, you have your expertise, but you can't let that expertise dominate the debate, because when you're trying to solve those problems, you have to bring all these things together. And I think you need that inclusiveness around these specialist disciplines to bring it all together. And I think this is where you come to this concept of maybe a development specialist or development professional, or indeed a government professional, because if you're in that Borno government, you need a comprehensive plan. So I think it's that, that's the way I would look at it. The problems on the ground are never purely security or social development or governance. There's always a multidimensional one. So I think you have to bring this multidimensional perspective to it. And if your individual expertise is only in one of those areas, then you need to be able to work with colleagues with the other disciplines and come up with a plan that addresses the issues more comprehensively, rather than just one aspect of them. And I think this is the challenge that we have often as an international community, is that we try and address things from too many different perspectives separately, rather than looking to bring them together more comprehensively.
I find that as someone whose professional interest is more aligned to the governance side than to sectors, if there is a side, don't you find that the people that focus on issues of health, education, humanitarian work tend to take more of an advocacy lens to their work? So they want things to be the way they should be. It is the governance person that will say, well, we can't afford it. We need to, yes, it's important to do education, but we also need to do security, and we need to do infrastructure, and we need to do a few other things.
Yeah.
Have you found that in your career?
Very much so. Yeah, and I think this was one of the issues we were looking at in coming out of conflict in Congo. And I remember talking to colleagues again from other development agencies, and they were all arguing that the government of Congo should spend more money on education, health, or whatever. Whereas actually, I think the first need of anybody is security. Now, international development people don't normally like saying, you need to spend more money on guns. But actually, you can't do water, health, roads, anything if people are unsafe. And that security has to come first. Yeah. So, this is why I think it's very, it's difficult for someone external to come to a country and say, you should spend more money on education, or you need to raise your level of health spending. Actually, what you need, this is, I think, where the governance side of things come in. What you really need is a properly inclusive budget-making process that allows the priorities of the country to come through, and the representatives of the people to then make those choices. So it's not right for me as a civil servant from another country to come into somewhere and say, look, you're not spending enough on education. It may be true that the country could do more on education. You can always do more on education, but whether the right balance is there between how much is spent on education or infrastructure or security is really a political choice for that country. So I would much rather, as a governance practitioner, help support those sort of countries' budget-making processes to make sure they're more efficient and they're more inclusive, than come in and say that we should do more on this, that, or the other, or the government should do more on some particular area. I think those budget-making processes are really fundamental, and I think that's where the sovereignty in many ways is found, is in that inclusive budget-making process voted by Parliament representatives of the people, and then the money collected in taxes then spent according to that budget. So for me, that is the center of so many things, rather than an individual specialist saying, the government should do more on this, that, or the other. For me, it's that integrity of the budget process which is fundamental.
Absolutely, and it was the economist Joseph Schumpeter that said the budget is the skeleton of the state, stripped of all misleading ideology. And so yes, but that of course is assuming that it is a properly developed budget that is fully inclusive and representative of what the people want to do. But another area that is a lot of work on is anti-corruption. And again, with fondness, the support you gave to the anti-corruption efforts in Nigeria on behalf of DFID. Does the nature of corruption vary in the various places that you've worked? I mean, if you were to compare the DRC, Ethiopia, Somalia, Sudan, Nigeria, Tanzania, where you currently are, what significant differences have you observed in terms of the nature and patterns of corruption in these places?
I think some things are different, and some things I think you find everywhere. I think at the level of the sort of, you might call sort of petty bribery, whether that's policemen in the streets or access to healthcare, I think some of the issues are pretty similar everywhere. I think where things differ, what I've seen, is around the areas of large-scale theft at the sort of top of the state, from the political classes. And this, I think, is, there is a difference there. And I think part of the reason for that difference is around the concept of the nation that the politicians have. Do the political elite believe in the idea of the nation and their project that they're trying to implement? Or do they actually associate, is their identity elsewhere? And I think, my experience from working in Ethiopia was that, I felt that, the EPRDF were committed to their development vision for the country. Now, I know not necessarily everybody would agree with that development vision or indeed how they implemented it, but I certainly felt that as a collective group of leaders, they were committed to that vision. And therefore, both collectively and individually, they didn't want to put their state's resources in their own pocket. They genuinely wanted to use those resources for the development of the country. Now, if you take other parts in Africa where the identity of the nation, I think, is less well supported or established, then I think you do find a tendency for elites, for politicians to not buy into that vision and to have an identity elsewhere. Now, I was struck from my time in Nigeria that when we looked at where people thought it might be acceptable to steal money from and where not, quite a lot of people thought that federal government money was fair game, or oil money was fair game. They didn't really associate that with themselves in terms of their money or that sense of the nation's money. But take it down to more local level, and I think people felt, no, you can't. If at the very local level, if you're a group of friends collecting money for someone's present, no, that's a no. You can't possibly steal that. There's a difference between in people's minds, I think, as to what is acceptable and where their identity lies. So certainly, I think there are differences in that respect around the sort of respect and identity. The other difference, of course, is around and this goes with it, the strengths of institutions. Now, if we come to, again, my experience from Congo, institutions were very weak. A lot of work has been done to sort of build those institutions. But when those institutions are weak, then clearly there are temptations and pressures on people. And this is where you come into some of those cultural aspects, particularly where the state doesn't deliver for people. Where the local government presence is not there, where the state doesn't deliver education and health services. Clearly, people feel under a lot of pressure to find shortcuts to whether that's rewarding their supporters or indeed building something in their village, but outside the system. So yeah, I think a number of similarities, but also some key differences in the in the nature of the state as to then what type of corruption you then find. And of course, when it comes to fighting that, I think you then have to understand some of that context in order to think about how you can work with stakeholders in the country to reduce that corruption and get the resources used for the benefit of everybody rather than a benefit of the few.
If you were to look across the continent, where do you see the trajectory going? Upwards, downwards, about the same?
Sorry, Joe, you're breaking up for that question. I didn't quite get that one.
Okay, so I was saying if you were to look across the continent in terms of the trajectory for anti-corruption, would you say it's going, is better, getting worse, or staying about the same?
It's difficult to say, actually, looking across, because I think some countries are making progress, whereas perhaps other countries are struggling a bit more. I'm not sure I could say across the board whether there's an overall direction. I think there's greater understanding now among sort of civil society activists of the damage that corruption does. I think if we go back to the first question, I think people understand why you want the rule of law and why you want democratic institutions as a control on politicians and politicians' behaviour. So I think there's been an increase across the board in sort of that level of understanding and the role of civil society across the continent. I have to say that results can be mixed, and I'm not sure that everywhere is going in the right direction. But,
Okay, thanks, Oliver. So now I want to move beyond Africa and ask you some questions of a global nature. You see, big global goals like the Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals can give the impression that everything is equally important. You need to focus on health, education, gender, and they're all important. But we know how difficult it can be to make progress on multiple fronts simultaneously. If you had to pull just 3 levers that you think would catalyze development, make the most difference in shaping a more livable world, which would it be?
As you say, all these things are important. Of course, that's why they're on the list. Yeah, I would start, I think, with what I think where most sustainable change comes from, and that is sort of internal change. And I would pick on the question around empowerment, because issues around empowerment and accountability, I think, are fundamental. Where you've got a population that is empowered and able to hold their leadership to account, then I think you've got a basis for sustainable development. So in that question of empowerment, I would also include inclusion. So making sure that we've got the proper balance around, including everybody who's involved, whether that's sort of gender issues, whether that's around disability questions, whether that's around ethnic issues. But that sort of inclusive empowerment, I think, is the ultimately most sustainable lever of change. Because once you've got the population who are engaged and empowered, then they will fight hard to ensure that their leadership responds to what they need and delivers to the nation. So that would be my starting point. And I think that the sustainable change on development comes from within, not from without. But if you haven't got the broader international context, then you are going to struggle. So I would, I think, another lever I would use is this one around international financial flows. I think it's so dispiriting, for you to work hard in one country to fight corruption, and then you find that money is taken out of the country, or people are able to flee the country and live their lives, on the proceeds of what they have stolen from one country, and then they're sort of welcomed by others around the world. Now, I don't think that's acceptable. Now, I think that if you want to support countries in fighting corruption and development, then I think we need to do more on controlling those financial flows, making sure that money is returned where it's stolen and stashed abroad somewhere, that it's discovered and returned, and that criminals who are seeking to enjoy their sort of ill-gotten gains in luxury somewhere, can then be investigated, prosecuted, and returned and put on trial. I think that that sort of international lever can do a lot then to help those countries that are doing well themselves and fighting corruption, but need that international support. So I think that would be my second one. And then my third one, looking at things from another perspective, I think we can't ignore climate change. I think that is something we have to work on collectively, both in countries and at an international level. So there are things we can do. Of course, a lot of things have been done. There's more we can do on climate change. And I would say that is, in my top three, I would include climate change as one of the areas we need to continue or indeed increase our efforts on.
Okay, thanks, Oliver. I think the issue of climate change is a debate worth having, particularly in the developing world, because the effects of climate change are probably more drastic in the developing world, but at the same time, many people in the developing world will tell you, well, we need to develop first, and then we would worry about the climate afterwards. After all, that's what Europe and the West did. So it's a real discussion to have. We're seeing very severe flooding in many parts of the developing world. We're seeing erosion. We're seeing new illnesses, many of which are traceable to changes in climate. So I think it's a real debate that affects economy, it affects longevity of life, it affects so many different things. So really, really important point that you raised. Okay, and that leads me nicely to the next question. Being that, as you say, you do not represent the UK government or on this interaction we're having, but given the recent merger between DFID and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office to form the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, and the fact that DFID was reputed as about the best development agency in the world, and then the fact that given recent developments like Brexit, the UK government has also to focus on trade. Out of this merger, do you foresee a tension between aid and trade?
Yeah, Joe, I think there are always tensions in government. I think I'm sure, I think you probably agree with me on that one, that across different aspects of government, from whatever ministry compared to another, there are always tensions. Government has to make choices between these things. There are tensions in the international development world. There are tensions in domestic policies. What do you do first? Do you build a road first if your money is limited, or do you build the health center first? If you can't do both, maybe you've got you had the government is about choices. I think all the way through. As you come back to that sort of inclusive budget process. So I think whether we as DFID and FCO are two government departments or one, I think the tensions between potentially different policy objectives are still there. I think that the plan, and indeed my hope, that through the merger, we're able to address those tensions perhaps more easily and more effectively, and maybe earlier on. May give you an example of one of the tensions I remember, and an example I use at a sort of very small scale level. You'll remember the Treasury single account when it came in Nigeria, and there was a very large amount of money held in that government agencies held in commercial banks. And that money was quite rightly brought back into the government system as very, very successful policy. Now, at that point, from a development side, we've been supporting Nigeria for many years in developing that policy and recognize the importance of that policy for Nigeria. Yet, colleagues of mine who were looking at issues around trade and more commercial issues are saying, hang on a minute, how are the banks going to cope if you take all that money away from them? Treasury single account, bad idea. It's damaging the banks. So it depends on your perspective. In that case, we took the view that the implementation of the TSA was the greater good over the long term than a shorter gain or a shorter term worry about stability of commercial banks. Although not to say that stability of banks isn't important, it is. Banking collapse obviously is a very serious matter. So I think a lot of these tensions can be resolved if you look at different timescales. Do you do a deal in the short term, or do you create the conditions for more deals to happen in the future? So I think that bringing together these two departments, in the FCDO, should enable us to be able to identify, resolve, and make choices better when it comes to dealing with some of these sort of tensions, making sure that we have a more coherent, coherent set of policies across the board.
Yeah, very interesting that you use the Treasury single account as an example. And it goes to the heart of what we're saying about corruption and governance issues, because the chairman of the Independent Corrupt Practices Commission announced yesterday that some agencies had created what they called a sub-treasury single account, with which they were basically getting access to monies that they shouldn't have been getting access to, and which should have been going into the broader treasury single account. And it's this constant struggle between the, if you like, the good guys and the bad guys, and the bad guys would always find a way to try and bug the system, and the good guys must find a way to continue to make that difficult to do. And that's why I say to people that those of us that work on governance issues will never be without a job, because there'll always be.
This is where, and I come back to, I think, to remember what I spoke quite a lot about in Nigeria, and I still think it's indeed very true. This question that fighting corruption, yes, you need sanctions, you need to investigate and lock people up when they've been found guilty of stealing money. You need the systems to prevent it, but ultimately it's the bigger change in society and in people's hearts and minds and behaviors which is the real winner. Because the systems, if you can always defeat systems if you get the right people together. If you don't have strong institutions, and of course you can always defeat the idea of sanctions. We've seen cases get very, very complicated, not only in Nigeria when they're big corruption cases. They take a long time anywhere, and it's ultimately it's the society factor, I think, which is the biggest area of most impact on fighting corruption at all levels.
Very, very interesting perspective. Okay, I'm going to my final question before we take questions from the audience is that I see that after reading mathematics at the University of Manchester, which is something I could never have done. I was completely useless in mathematics, which is why I ended up reading law. I see that you attended the École Nationale d'Administration, I think, in Strasbourg. And that virtually every French prime minister has attended that school. Do you think we should make it compulsory for politicians to go to schools like this to learn about public administration, to learn about constitutional governance, to learn about democracy?
I think it's extremely important that that politicians, particularly ministers, understand how government works. And I know it's one of the themes that you've talked about a lot, Joe, and I think you're absolutely right on that. In this particular case, ENA is primarily a school for civil servants, and only a minority of those who graduate from that school go into politics or indeed to finance, but they tend to be high-profile ones. So I think there are 2 points to it. One, it's really important to have a cadre of independent, expert, neutral civil servants. I think that is absolutely fundamental to development of any country. It's fundamental to democracy, as we were talking about earlier. You can't have a transition of power if all the top civil servants belong to one party. You need that independence at the top if you're going to have transition from power from one party to another. It's fundamental in fighting corruption because it says that in that senior civil service, in the sort of graduates that come out of ENA, there's a collectiveness, a solidarity, the shared methods and belief, which I think really serves both France very well, and indeed other sort of francophone countries that have a similar system. It serves them very well. So I think it's really important for the structure of a nation to have that sort of quality senior civil service, and the ENA type school is I think very important. I wish we had something similar in the UK. But when it comes to politicians, I think you're absolutely right. They need to know how government works. If you don't know how government works as a politician, I think you will be very ineffective. You need to know how to what civil service does, what is obviously the role of the institutions, and how to work with your sort of permanent secretary in order to get things done, the roles of each one. So some form of training, I think, is definitely required. There are very few jobs that you can enter without any training, but often a minister indeed is one of them. So I don't think you'd want to necessarily put too many sort of qualifications on the job and limit the sort of electorate choice as who they choose, but at least some form of more training around for politicians, and in particular sort of when people take up ministerial jobs, I think is important.
Thanks, Oliver. And I think that to be fair to the UK, most of the prime ministers or many of the senior government officials do study fairly the same courses, politics, philosophy, and economics in Oxford or Cambridge. So there is a uniformity of training in some sense. Okay, so I've got a few questions from the audience. So Ashish Maka wants to know how we have sustainability approach in cities and how much this has to do with government. And she's asking, is Nigeria moving towards sustainability, and how far are we looking at? I'm not sure if that's for me or for you, but let me answer the Nigeria part. Yes, a lot of work is going on with regards to trying to assure greater sustainability. It's a long-term process. I think described some of the issues quite eloquently about this feeling of nationhood, because in the same way, if you care about not stealing from your government, you also care about the environment in which you live and work. So I think the two are related. But I'll be happy if you offer any thoughts on that, Oliver. If you.
Yeah, I think one comment maybe coming back to questions of money and indeed structure. I think when you're looking at sort of city governance, there are a lot of different models around the world, but ultimately, you need the right type of authority. The city, a lot of cities have sort of grown organically, And the growth of the city has grown beyond the sort of administrative structures that they may have had to start with. So I think this whole question of a city authority is a very important one, that they have the right money and the right level of sort of competence to tackle the problems of the city as a whole. All too often you find that they're not at the city level at all, they're at the central government level, or there are some sort of district level lower down. So if you want to sustainably tackle the issues, I think at a city level, you do need to look at these questions of city governance as well.
Right. Okay. Our mutual friend, Andrew Fleming, to know what one or two achievements do you feel to be the proudest in your illustrious career, and why specifically those among so many?
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. Good to have you on this call as well. I think one of the beauties or delights of the governance work, is, as I said, it's helping other people do things. It's not doing things yourself, because as governance professionals, we can't do change, but you can help others do change. Let me pick a couple of things where I think that I look back on. I think one is saying the elections in Congo in was it now 2006, 2005, where they were the first elections, sort of this is saying first democratic elections. We worked very closely with the Congolese police at the time to support them on election security. One of the things we did was set up a nationwide net communications and training plan that enabled that sort of security to be provided across the country for the elections. And they were great partners to work with. We had great technical people coming in from South Africa, from Angola, from France, from the UN, from the UK. It was a really fantastic team of people working on it. Everybody very committed on both sides, and it worked very well. I think that's certainly one of my highlights in terms of the way that worked. Okay. I think we come to.
Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, Joe. Yeah, I was gonna pick out the way that Nigeria sort of picked up the Open Government Partnership. I remember that our sort of DFID team at the time, we sort of encouraged people to pick that up and work on it. And I know you Joe, were instrumental in that too. And I think helping Nigeria pick up OGP and take that forward and make that sort of and run with it, I think was a big step. And I think back of some of the things that we supported, and I think getting that going for Nigeria, I think was a big step.
Okay. There's a related question from an anonymous attendee. What has been your biggest challenge thus far?
Biggest challenge.
Both in terms of both in the. Okay, I want to ask this to you both in the frame of your governance experience. Okay, so you go first.
Biggest challenge. Let's think about it. It's not on a technical level, because I think, often the technical issues are well known. It's implementing those technical challenges in a political environment. And I think that's the biggest challenge when all the political incentives push in one direction. How do you help people push against that wave? Come back to this question of corruption. How do you work with the individual in the system, who actually, when the system is corrupt? Again, let me think about, let me give an example from Congo. I think of that sort of challenge of what you do in those circumstances. Now, I remember in Eastern DRC at the time, there was very little transport infrastructure. Yet the law still said if you arrested somebody, you had to basically sort of bring them up before a magistrate, within 24, 48 hours. I can't remember exactly what the time period was. It was a fairly short one, as is normally the case. Now, if you were a police officer and you arrested somebody, you would have to walk for a week, through the countryside in order to get to the magistrate. Now, what do you do in those circumstances, particularly if the person you've arrested is a mass murderer? You can't let them go, yet you can't respect the law. So the lawyer, Joe, you're a lawyer. From your legal perspective, I had this discussion with a number of lawyers, and they would say that police officer has to let the person go because that's what the law says. And I would say that's not justice. That's not justice. You can't allow, if that man, if the suspected criminal, and that the police officer has good reason to believe that that person, is a mass murderer or a cannibal, and this is what went on, then there's a bigger question on justice that is served, and that person should walk as they did, handcuffed to the criminal across the country for a week and take them to the magistrate. So I think that police officer was doing what was required by justice and duty, rather than saying, I can't present this person to the magistrate within 48 hours, therefore I must let them go. Now, dealing with those sort of topics, I think, is really, really challenging, because the rule of law is really important. So what do you do? What, as a governance person, what advice do you give in those circumstances? Because you can't just say change the law, because Parliament, Parliament maybe is a transitional Parliament, and can't change that law. Facing some of those challenges, I think, is really, really, really difficult. There's problems that people are facing.
It is difficult. I'll tell you a story. Someone landed in Heathrow and took a black cab and said, take me to the Royal Courts of Justice. And the cabman said, it doesn't exist. I can take you to the Royal Courts, but there is no Royal Courts of Justice, because it's all about applying the law. In my case, it's very similar to what you said. As you know, I have an academic interest in some of these things, and I went into government researching the importance of political will, and I came out of government researching when political will is not enough to drive change. So you can see the sort of tension that one deals with matters. Okay, I'll take one last question, which is, what is the role of women in ensuring good governance? How important is it to manage gender balance?
Yeah, I think it's extremely important. I think it's important from a number of perspectives. And I'm pleased to say that we've been able to, one of the key things that we've worked on during my career, and it is women's empowerment and supporting women to be more involved in politics and to be elected, that's sort of local parliaments or national parliaments. And it's difficult, it's very difficult. For all sorts of reasons, and we haven't always been that successful. But I think it is incredibly important. Equally, when you're looking at issues around conflicts, when you bring in sort of broader voices, particularly women's voices, then somehow pathways to peace can open up that sort of weren't there before. So I think it is sort of central to what we do.
Oliver, it's been a fantastic pleasure talking to you over the last hour or so. I've learned so much, as I always do, from you. I'm really grateful that you made time to have this discussion. And I look forward to listening in to the person that you interview next. What may be your sort of focal areas when you interview the next person?
Joe, thank you, and it's been a real pleasure. This is a fascinating area. We could have talked a lot longer. I want to look at the issue around justice and sustainability. How important is justice, whether that's local level justice, a community level, or more higher level justice? What is the role of justice in sustainability? I'm hoping that can be my theme.
That would be really fascinating. I look forward to joining the conversation. Thank you so much, Oliver. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone, for listening in.
Thank you. Okay, bye.